tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
I want to turn to some cost of living issues, which are very much affecting Canadians. We spoke about inflation a fair bit last week, and I know we'll have a bit of a more in-depth look at this in a couple of weeks with Franco Terrazzano of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. But I think one of the big things that it's important to identify here is that for most Canadians who are grappling with inflation, there isn't just one instant snap of the finger solution. There are a number of inputs here. There's general inflation, supply chain issues. There are the increases to the carbon tax. And one that doesn't often get discussed, but I think is important here, is the increases to payroll taxes, which if you're talking about thousands of dollars a year that Canadians are spending more on groceries and taxes, a few hundred a year in payroll taxes is quite significant. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business is calling on the federal government to pause the planned increase of EI and CPP premiums, which will take about $305 away from the average Canadian worker next year. Dan Kelly, president of the CFIB, joins me now. Dan, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today. Do we have you there, Dan?
I can hear you. Hope you can hear me.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, we had a little bit of a technical issue there. Let's talk about what this is first off. These premiums go up every year, but we're also talking about a year that isn't exactly business as usual economically for Canadian families.
No, I mean, typically there is an increase in the maximum amount that we can pay CPP and EI on, but the rate generally has not risen. In fact, for 2 years, the federal government froze the employment insurance rates because they recognized the economy was in rough shape. Canadians were struggling through the pandemic, and so they kept those rates frozen. Now they've removed that cap on EI, and they're in the process of raising CPP rates significantly over a 7-year period. Those two things combined are going to raise employees' payroll taxes by over 6% this year. As you said, about a $305 increase, up to a $305 increase for the employee, $325 increase for the employer. So your payroll on January 1 for most working Canadians will drop. That's in the face of an environment where we're all dealing with the inflationary pressures on everything that we buy. We're seeing EI CPP premiums rise, and then, as you noted, later in the spring, in most provinces, an increase in the carbon tax as well as an increase in liquor taxes.
Do you recall in the last couple of years when the government put this freeze in, when that decision was made? What I mean by that basically is, are we past that point where the government could easily do something about this?
Look, the government could even now announce a freeze or retroactively take out the increase. There are ways to do that. In fact, in 2015 and 2016, the Liberals, just as they took power, put a 2-year freeze on a 2-year reduction plan for small businesses on their share of the EI bill. That could happen as soon as budget 2023. So it's not too late. But we're a couple of weeks away from January 1, and rates are expected to rise. They did increase them. The Liberals did increase Canada Pension Plan premiums in both COVID years, in 2021 and 2022. They're doing it again this year, despite the fact we're all dealing with wicked inflation levels. When you take $300 out of somebody's take-home income, that's a round or two of groceries for many Canadian families at a time when Canadians are really struggling. The benefits for CPP, the future benefits, they're going to be that increase is going to be phased in over the next 40 years. So putting a 1-year pause in place, we don't think is too tall an order. Unfortunately, the government has ignored these calls and is moving ahead.
Now, if you're self-employed, you're getting hit on both ends of this, aren't you? The employer and the employee side?
You're quite right. You don't have to face EI premiums, but on Canada Pension Plan, you pay both the share as the employee and you pay the share as the employer on self-employment income. So you could have hundreds and hundreds of dollars of increased Canada Pension Plan premiums, and the self-employed really were huge losers out of COVID. For the business, of course, this is adding additional pressure. I mean, we talk about the inflationary pressures on average Canadians. For business owners, they're seeing that pressure on every line of their budget. And of course, with rising taxes, these payroll taxes, that obviously saps their ability to provide raises for their employees to deal with the inflationary pressure that they're facing. So it's a pretty vicious circle right now.
I know that there's this vision that I don't even know if it's an intentional one, but this approach of the business owner as being the miserly one that doesn't want to give their employees benefits. And you know, any small business owner I've ever spoken to would love to pay their employees a lot more, but sometimes they look at their balance sheet and that money just isn't there. So when you're talking about, you know, a few $100s per employee, if you've got 10 employees, that $3,000 is not insignificant on some small businesses, is it?
It's not at all. And look, I mean, we have to also put the context of what's happening right now. Sure, the COVID restrictions are behind us, but if you can believe it, only half of small businesses say that they are back to 2019 levels of sales. For many, they're not seeing customers return in the volume that they did pre-pandemic. On top of that, just to get through the restrictions of the last 2 years, the average small firm has taken on $110,000 in debt. That's how much they now owe, exposed to higher interest rates that they're having to make good on. And they're seeing these cost pressures. So lower sales, more debt at higher interest rates, and huge cost increases. This is not the boom times that people were predicting coming out of COVID. That many of the articles were breathlessly talking about. Sadly, for many small businesses, these remain pretty bleak times. Small business optimism, if you can believe it, is actually fairly close to the low levels it was at the beginning of the pandemic. That's how bad it is for small businesses, and yet the federal government feels like this is a great time to jack up taxes.
Yeah, I mean, there's always been that divide that people have seen between the financial economy and the real economy, between the picture of the economy that you might see looking at the stock market, although not always, and what you see when you look on the ground. And again, a lot of people have made billions in the pandemic, but for a lot of small business owners, they haven't seen that. They haven't seen that, you know, incredible financial success story that Amazon has.
No, well, look, restrictions really hit independent businesses particularly hard, especially in retail, hospitality, the service sector, arts and entertainment, travel and tourism. These were the sectors that were most directly affected by COVID restrictions. They took it on the chin to try to get through. Yes, there were government support programs in place, but our data shows that only about 1/3 of the cost to business was covered by COVID subsidies. 2/3 was borne by the business itself. This is deeply unfair at this stage. And business owners are saying, look, give us a bit of a breather here before you start to return to raising taxes. You add to that the carbon tax increase that we're expecting in April. And for small businesses, that's especially deadly. Small firms don't qualify for any of the rebates that supposedly are there for consumers. They basically are just payers of the carbon tax itself. Liquor tax increases affect hospitality and some in the retail sector. We need to make sure that Canadians have dollars to spend in businesses. We're not doing a lot to help them.
I know that you have obviously called first and foremost for a freeze on these increases. Another idea is putting forward a refundable tax credit, and you mentioned 2015, 2016 on that. The freeze would be, in your view, the ideal response, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, if our first choice is to put the brakes on the increase that is expected for January 1. I'm not optimistic that that's going to happen, only 2 weeks away from the new year. But you know, that would be the best course of action for the federal government to take. But there are ways even after that to try to offset these costs. Even if they're not going to offset them for average Canadians, trying to remove some of the payroll burden on Canadian employers would be helpful. And there are ways through a mix of credits, tax reductions, and other ways that the federal government can come to the aid of small and medium-sized firms.
Now,
You know,
do you
we've got all
Go
sorts
ahead.
of pressures right now, and we need to get a few of them taken off our list.
Have you found that Chrystia Freeland, the finance minister, actually hears you out when you've brought these concerns historically, or do you find that the government is just completely detached from the reality of what small business owners are facing?
Well, look, I've been doing this a long time, and when the Liberals took office, there was no secret that the finance minister, Bill Bourneau, did not listen one bit to the concerns of small business owners, and that's when the CPP increase plan was first hatched. It was negotiated, and I will say, criticism of the federal government alone does not set CPP rates. Many provincial governments, including conservative provincial governments, supported the increase in the Canada Pension Plan. We're trying to convince some of those same governments to press pause. When the Deputy Prime Minister, when Chrystia Freeland took the reins in finance, she did listen to many of our requests over the course of the pandemic. Some of the work that we did to try to make sure that there were effective subsidy programs in place for small business. But that remains incomplete. And right now, what businesses need is a little bit of relief. There was in the fall economic statement a plan to reduce credit card processing fees. That's good news. I'm hoping to be speaking to her before the holidays in the next couple of days, and we'll be putting this request to her once again to see if small firms can get at least some relief from the massive pressures that auto is imposing right now.
I wasn't going to go there, but since you mentioned credit card processing fees, I don't know if a lot of consumers realize how disruptive those are to businesses.
Oh gosh, the average consumer, of course, thinks that the credit card industry is funded through the annual fee they might pay to get a premium card, or is funded by the interest that they might pay if they carry a balance on their credit card. What they don't know, for the most part, is that every time that card is swiped or chipped, the merchant pays a fee somewhere in the range of 1.5% to 2.5% of the sale for the courtesy of making that transaction happen. That's somewhere in the range of $5 to $10 billion a year that Canadians pay that is embedded in the prices of everything that we buy. And those fees, sadly, in Canada are among the highest in the world. So it is good that the government has talked about finding ways to lower the pressure of these fees on average Canadians. We're working to make sure that actually happens, putting some ideas forward to government, to Visa, to MasterCard. But the pressures are there. The rewards that your free trip to Florida that you may never get, that's funded by consumers that are paying with cash, paying with debit. So it's actually in many ways a wealth transfer from low-income Canadians that pay with cash and debit to wealthier Canadians that have one of these premium credit cards. That's something that I think very few understand.
Yeah, and I'm guilty of it as well, because don't get me wrong, I've got credit cards that, give me Aeroplan points, and I use those things, but it's not coming out, like it's not being conjured out of thin air. Someone is paying for that.
You got it. It's the merchant ultimately, and then that gets passed back to the consumer. So we think that a fair system would be to keep these fees low, as is the case in many other countries in the world. The reward schemes are still there, but it's unfair that the merchant has to pay for the reward schemes, the customer loyalty schemes that really do reward the banks and the customers of the banks in the end. That's not the way that this is supposed to work.
All right, so here's, I guess, where we get down to the action item here. We're looking at this increase going in January 1st, and I think you mentioned earlier that technically there are options after January 1st, but this is really the crunch time if there's going to be a freeze, most likely, on these increases in premiums, correct?
You got it, and we have a petition on our website right now directed at the federal government and provinces to press pause on the EI and CPP premium increases that are expected that are planned for January 1st. Again, I think, one of my observations about Canadians is we actually don't mind paying higher taxes. We actually don't mind fees. We just don't want to know about it. And that's the problem with CPP and EI. Because it comes off our paychecks, most people, it flies right under their radar. And then they realize in January, hey, I'm a little bit poorer, not drawing the connection, sadly, between the policies that the government's putting in place and their bottom line.
All right, and yeah, certainly I know I get a lot of emails from people who are self-employed. You'll certainly see both ends of that as well. Dan Kelly, president of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, thanks very much, and that petition is on the CFIB website. So have a good one, Dan. Merry Christmas to you.
You too. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.